Rancher gave a ride to an Apache widow. By law, he became the man she must marry. John Harper was a man shaped by the wide, open lands of Arizona. The sun rose over the horizon, casting golden light over his ranch, and the soft wind carried the scent of dry earth and sagebrush. John had spent most of his life here, tending to his cattle, fixing fences, and riding along the dusty trails that stretched for miles. He was a man of few words but of strong principles, and the people in the nearby town knew him as someone reliable, brave, and fair. The ranch was his life, and he treated it like a living thing, knowing that every morning and every task mattered if the land was to flourish. On this particular morning, John was checking on the cattle grazing near the edge of a narrow trail that led toward the Apache reservation. The sun was bright, but the air carried a chill from the night, and John could see the faint mist rising from the ground. As he guided his horse along the path, he noticed something unusual, a lone figure struggling along the road, walking with slow, heavy steps. At first, he thought it might be a traveler, perhaps someone who had lost their way in the vast desert. But as he rode closer, he realized it was a woman. She was dressed in simple, worn clothing that had clearly seen better days. Her hair was dark and long, flowing over her shoulders, but it was tangled and dusty. She moved with a quiet dignity, yet there was a sadness in her eyes that John could not ignore. Something about her drew him in, a mix of curiosity and concern. He slowed his horse and called out, "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help?" The woman looked up, startled at first, but then relief softened her expression. She nodded slowly. I need to reach my people," she said quietly. Her voice was soft but carried a strength that surprised John. "I am trying to reach my village. I have lost my way and I have no one to help me." John studied her for a moment. He could see the weariness in her posture, the signs of a long and difficult journey. He knew the land well, and he could tell that she had been walking for days. The thought of leaving her to continue alone through the harsh terrain made him uneasy. Even though he understood the potential complications, crossing cultural boundaries, getting involved in matters he did not fully understand, he felt a strong pull to help her. "You can ride with me," he said firmly. "I can take you to the trail that leads to your village. It's safer than walking alone, especially out here where the sun is harsh and the nights are cold." The woman hesitated, glancing down at the dirt road. There was a mixture of gratitude and hesitation in her eyes. She seemed aware of some unspoken rule or tradition that might make this offer more than just an act of kindness. Yet the exhaustion on her face told John that she could not continue on her own. Finally, she nodded, and with a gentle movement, she climbed into the wagon beside him. As they traveled together, John tried to make conversation, though he was aware of the delicate balance between friendliness and respect. "My name is John Harper," he said, tipping his hat. "Where are you headed?" The woman's eyes met his, calm but distant. "I am called Nahel," she said. "I am going to my village. My husband, he has passed, and I must return to my people." There was a quiet sadness in her voice, a grief that seemed to weigh her down more than the sun or the dusty road. John nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. He had seen loss in his life, friends who died in accidents, neighbors who struggled with hardships, but the pain in her voice was different. It was deep, personal, and tied to a culture and law he barely understood. He remained silent for a while, letting the wagon wheels creak rhythmically as the horse moved steadily forward. As the miles passed, Nahel began to speak of her journey, her voice softening as she described the challenges she had faced. She told John of the river crossings, the barren stretches of land where water was scarce, and the nights spent under the stars with only a thin blanket for warmth. John listened intently, realizing how much courage it took for her to survive alone in such harsh conditions. At times, the wind would catch and swirl dust around them, and John would instinctively shield her from it, holding his arm in a protective gesture. Nahel seemed to notice, and although she did not speak of it, there was a small, appreciative smile that touched her lips. For the first time since her journey began, she felt a sense of safety, a feeling she had not experienced in many days. The conversation gradually turned to lighter subjects. John told her stories of life on the ranch, the mischievous antics of the cattle, the stubbornness of his old mule, and the way the desert came alive with color at sunset. Nahel listened, sometimes smiling, sometimes laughing quietly, as the sound of her laughter echoed softly over the open land. It was a sound that warmed John's heart, though he did not fully understand why. As they approached the boundary of the Apache settlement, the landscape began to change. The trees grew thicker, the earth richer, and there was a sense of life that felt different from the open ranchlands. John could see distant figures moving along the path, watching them as they approached. He felt a moment of unease. He was a stranger here, and he knew that crossing into this land carried certain responsibilities. Nahel spoke quietly, almost as if to herself, explaining that the customs of her people were very strict. When a widow is helped on her journey, the man who helps may be considered responsible for her, she said softly. It is the way of our people. John felt a sudden tension. He had known there might be consequences, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. He thought about what this might mean for him, his freedom, his life on the ranch, the reactions of his neighbors. But he could see the wisdom and fairness in respecting her culture. The elders of the Apache village were waiting as they arrived. They were solemn, yet not unkind, and they watched John and Nahel with careful eyes. John stepped down from the wagon, offering Nahel his hand to help her onto solid ground. She accepted, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of gratitude and respect. The elders spoke quietly among themselves, and then one of them addressed John, explaining that by giving her a ride, he had fulfilled a sacred responsibility. The words were simple, but their meaning was profound. John felt a mixture of pride, apprehension, and uncertainty. He had acted from kindness, but now that kindness carried a weight he had not anticipated. Nahel, too, felt a mixture of relief and worry. She had survived the journey, but now she faced a new challenge, one that would test her trust, her resilience, and her willingness to follow the traditions of her people. For a long moment they stood there, the wind carrying the scent of pine and earth, and the sun casting long shadows across the land. Neither spoke, but a quiet understanding passed between them. They were bound together by circumstance, by law, and by the fragile thread of trust that had grown during their journey. As John prepared to leave, Nahel spoke once more, her voice gentle but firm. "You have done more than help me survive," she said. "You have honored my people. That is something I will never forget." John nodded, unsure how to respond, but he knew he would remember this moment for the rest of his life. The journey had changed something in both of them. What began as a simple act of kindness had become the start of a bond, neither fully understood yet. John returned to his wagon, looking back at Nahel and the settlement, aware that the coming days would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and perhaps the beginning of a story that neither he nor Nahel could have imagined when they first met on that dusty trail. And so, under the vast Arizona sky, with the wind whispering through the trees and the cattle grazing quietly in the distance, the stage was set for a journey far greater than either of them had anticipated. A journey of trust, honor, and the delicate weaving of two very different worlds together. John Harper stayed near the edge of the Apache settlement, watching as the elders guided Nahel through their small village. The adobe homes were low and strong, built to withstand the harsh sun and sudden storms of the desert. Smoke rose gently from cooking fires, carrying the aroma of herbs and roasted meats. Children laughed and ran along the paths, their bare feet kicking up soft dust. The village was alive with quiet energy, a rhythm that John had never known on his ranch. Nahel walked with careful steps, her head held high, yet her eyes darted around nervously. She had returned to her people, but the journey had left her drained, and now she faced the scrutiny of her tribe's elders. John followed at a respectful distance, unsure of how to act. He knew that the customs here were deeply rooted, and any wrong move could bring trouble, not just for him, but for Nahel as well. An elder, a tall man with silver hair and wise eyes, approached them. His presence was calm but commanding. "John Harper," he said, his voice steady, "you have helped Nahel reach our village safely. That is honorable. But as you may know, the custom is clear. By aiding a widow, you are now bound to her according to our law." John felt a tightening in his chest. He had suspected that helping her might come with obligations, but hearing the words spoken so plainly made him realize the seriousness of the situation. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. I understand," he said slowly. "I meant only to help her." "I did not know it would carry this responsibility." The elder nodded. "Intent is important, but the law is stronger than intent. You have shown kindness, but now that kindness carries a duty. It is not meant to punish, but to protect. Nahel is without a husband, and this tradition ensures she will not be left alone." Nahel's eyes met John's, and he could see the mixture of emotions in her gaze. She felt relief that he had been honest, but also uncertainty about what the future might hold. She had lived her life according to the customs of her people, but she had never imagined that a stranger from outside her world would become so deeply connected to her by law. John took a deep breath. He respected her culture, and he could see the fairness in their customs. But he also thought about his own life, the ranch, the cattle, the neighbors who would talk, and the life he had built. This was a crossroads he had never anticipated. Yet looking at Nahel, he realized that walking away now would feel like abandoning her in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. The elder motioned for them to sit near a fire, and John and Nahel complied. The other elders circled them, speaking softly in their language, occasionally glancing at John to ensure he understood. They were not unkind, but their presence reminded him of the gravity of the situation. One who helps a widow does not simply give her a ride, the elder explained. It is an act of protection, of commitment. It is a promise. You will live by our law, and you will care for her as your own family. John nodded, the weight of the words settling on his shoulders. I understand, he repeated, though inside he was still processing the reality of the commitment. It was not fear that gripped him, it was respect. He wanted to do right by Nahel, and by agreeing to honor her people's customs, he knew he was taking a step into a life he had never planned. Nahel spoke softly, her voice steady but gentle. John, I know this is difficult for you. It is unusual for someone from outside our people to be bound by our law, but I am grateful. You saved me when I had no one else. That is more than any words can express. John felt a mixture of pride and humility. He had acted from instinct, from a sense of decency that came naturally to him, but hearing her gratitude made him realize how important his actions had been. I only did what any decent person would do, he said. I could not leave you to struggle alone. The elders nodded at his words, seemingly satisfied by his sincerity. They began to explain more of the traditions and expectations. They told him that marriage in their culture was not simply a bond of love, but a bond of duty and respect. A man who became a husband to a widow was expected to support her, protect her, and ensure her well-being. In return, the widow gave loyalty and care, and together they formed a household that strengthened the community. John listened carefully, absorbing each detail. It was clear that this was not a casual agreement. He was stepping into a role that required responsibility, patience, and understanding. Yet, despite the seriousness, he could feel a quiet sense of purpose settling over him. He had always been someone who respected hard work and honor, and this challenge felt like another test of those values. Over the next few days, John began to learn more about Nahel's life and her people. He observed her daily routines, the way she gathered herbs and prepared food, and how she interacted with the children and elders. She was strong, intelligent, and resourceful, and John found himself admiring her quietly. She moved with a calm confidence that came from years of living in the desert, and her knowledge of the land was impressive. Nahel, in turn, watched John closely. He was respectful, patient, and willing to learn. He did not treat her as someone fragile or weak, but as a person capable of making decisions and contributing to their shared life. She began to see that he could be trusted, not just as a protector, but as a companion who could understand and respect her world. Despite the careful balance of tradition and duty, there were moments of lightness. John and Nahel shared meals, working side by side as they prepared food and cared for animals. They laughed quietly at small mistakes, like spilled water or stubborn animals that refused to cooperate. These moments were rare, but they were precious, and they helped both of them feel more at ease in an otherwise tense situation. Yet the shadow of uncertainty never fully disappeared. John knew that his neighbors and friends might question his decisions. Some might not understand why he had become involved with a woman from another culture, and others might even see it as a scandal. But he pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on what was immediately important, respecting the law of the Apache people and ensuring Nahel's safety and dignity. Nahel also faced her own inner struggles. She mourned the loss of her husband, a grief that sometimes returned in quiet moments when she was alone. She wondered if she could ever feel comfortable with someone new, even someone who had saved her. But at the same time, she recognized John's sincerity and strength. He had risked much to help her, and she began to consider that perhaps this unexpected bond could lead to something more than obligation. The elders continued to observe, offering guidance and advice. They taught John the ways of the land, the importance of respecting the seasons, and the knowledge passed down from generations. They shared lessons about balance, patience, and harmony. John listened with humility, realizing that this was more than just learning customs. It was learning a philosophy of life that had kept a people strong and united through centuries of challenge. As days turned into a week, John and Nahel settled into a careful rhythm. Mornings were spent tending to practical tasks, while afternoons were quieter, offering time for reflection and conversation. They spoke about the future, about responsibilities, and about hope. Each conversation deepened their understanding of each other, and slowly, a bond of trust began to grow. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, casting long shadows over the village, John and Nahel sat quietly by a small fire. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of night. They watched the sky turn shades of pink and orange, and for a moment neither spoke. The silence was comfortable, a rare gift after days of adjustment and uncertainty. Finally, Nahel broke the quiet. "I do not know what the future holds," she said softly, her voice thoughtful. "But I do know that you have helped me when I had no one else. That will never be forgotten." John nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and tenderness. "And I know that helping you was the right thing to do," he said. "I may not fully understand everything yet, but I want to do right by you and by your people. That is all I can promise for now." In that moment, under the vast Arizona sky, something shifted. The bond between them was no longer just about duty or law. It was about respect, trust, and the quiet beginnings of friendship. Both knew the journey ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, misunderstandings, and moments of doubt. But they also knew that together, they could face what came, guided by the principles of honor and integrity that both their worlds held dear. And so, the first days of their new life together passed, each moment filled with learning, growth, and cautious hope. John Harper, the rancher from the open plains, and Nahel, the widowed woman of the Apache tribe, were bound not just by law, but by the shared experience of survival, compassion, and the delicate steps toward trust and understanding. The path ahead was uncertain, but both of them were ready to walk it, one careful step at a time. The weeks following John Harper's arrival in the Apache settlement brought a rhythm of life that was both new and challenging. Each day began before sunrise, with the soft light casting long shadows across the desert land. John was used to the quiet mornings on his ranch, where the cattle moved slowly and the wind whispered across the plains. But here, life was busier, filled with the gentle bustle of a community that moved together, each person contributing to the well-being of all. Nahel became John's guide, teaching him the ways of her people and the land. She showed him how to gather wild herbs safely, which ones could be used for food, and which could help heal minor wounds. She explained the patterns of the river, how it shifted with the seasons, and how to read the signs of approaching storms. John listened carefully, noting every detail. For a man who had spent his life on his ranch, accustomed to routines he had learned over decades, this was a completely different education. Despite the lessons and the new knowledge, there were moments when John felt uncertain. The customs, while fair and wise, were foreign to him. He worried about accidentally breaking a rule or offending someone, but every time he looked at Nahel, he felt a steady reassurance. She moved with confidence and patience, never scolding him, only guiding him gently toward understanding. Their days were filled with practical work, tending to the small livestock kept by the tribe and helping repair structures that had been worn by wind and sun. John found himself enjoying the work in ways he had never imagined. It was harder than ranch life in some respects, requiring more finesse and care, but it brought satisfaction. Seeing tasks completed correctly, feeling the land respond to attention and care, and watching the community function as a whole gave him a deep sense of fulfillment. Nahel's presence made the work more bearable and even enjoyable. She had a way of making mundane tasks feel purposeful. When she instructed John on how to plant certain crops in the optimal way, she did so with clarity and warmth, and John could see how deeply knowledgeable she was. Slowly, he began to admire her not just for her survival and intelligence, but for her patience, kindness, and quiet strength. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, a sudden windstorm arose, lifting dust and small debris into the air. John and Nahel were gathering firewood when the storm struck. The sky darkened, and the wind howled through the canyon walls. John moved quickly to shield Nahel, placing himself between her and the gusts. She grabbed his arm instinctively, steadying herself as he guided her to shelter. Once the storm passed, they sat quietly, catching their breath and brushing dust from their clothes. Nahel looked at John with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "You always seem to know what to do," she said softly. John shrugged, feeling slightly embarrassed but also quietly pleased. "I only do what seems right," he replied. "I couldn't let you be in danger." Moments like these strengthened the bond between them. They began to share more personal stories, revealing pieces of themselves that had previously remained hidden. John spoke of his childhood on the ranch, of his parents who had taught him the value of hard work, honesty, and respect for the land. He spoke of the long days he had spent alone, tending cattle and maintaining fences, and how sometimes the loneliness weighed heavily on him. Nahel, in turn, spoke of her life before her husband's passing. She described the traditions of her people, the way her family had lived in harmony with the land for generations, and the quiet wisdom passed from elders to children. She shared her fears and hopes, admitting that while she was strong, she had been deeply lonely after losing her husband. John listened without interruption, offering comfort not with words, but with understanding and steady presence. As days turned into weeks, John and Nahel began to anticipate each other's thoughts and needs. They worked seamlessly together, whether gathering water from the river, tending to animals, or repairing fences and homes. Their actions were synchronized, a quiet partnership that spoke of mutual respect. It was in these moments that John began to understand that the bond forming between them was no longer solely about obligation. It was rooted in trust and genuine companionship. The community, too, began to notice the partnership. Children would run to watch them work, and elders would nod approvingly as John demonstrated willingness to learn and respect their ways. Though some outsiders might have doubted a man from the plains could adjust to such customs, John's sincerity and effort earned him acceptance. Nahel's presence made him even more human to the villagers, as she spoke of his helpfulness and reliability. Yet, challenges persisted. One morning, John discovered that a section of the village fence had been damaged by a sudden storm. He immediately began repairs, but the task was harder than expected. The wood was heavy and the terrain uneven. Nahel joined him, lifting logs and offering advice on the best angles for support. They worked side by side, their shared effort creating a rhythm that was almost like a dance. By mid-afternoon, their muscles ached, but the fence stood firm. They paused to drink water from their canteens, sharing a quiet moment of accomplishment. Nahel smiled, a faint but genuine smile, and John realized how much her opinion mattered to him. "We make a good team," she said softly. John chuckled. "I'd say more than good. I didn't know teamwork could feel like this." As the days continued, John began to appreciate the wisdom embedded in Apache traditions. Every action, every ritual, and every law carried purpose. He saw how these customs protected families, respected the land, and created harmony within the community. He realized that this was a life that demanded thoughtfulness, patience, and a deep sense of responsibility, qualities he had possessed, but now needed to refine. Nahel, too, began to see John differently. What had started as reliance had grown into admiration. He was not just strong and capable, he was honest, humble, and willing to learn. She felt a quiet warmth when he spoke to her with respect and treated her not as someone to be protected alone, but as an equal partner. Slowly, the walls of grief she had built around her heart began to soften. One evening, as the sun set in shades of pink and orange, John and Nahel were walking along a ridge overlooking the village. The air was warm but carried a gentle chill from the approaching night. They paused to watch the sky, the colors shifting and deepening as darkness approached. The view was breathtaking, and for a moment neither spoke. Finally, John broke the silence. "Nahel, I've spent my whole life on the plains, thinking I knew what it meant to survive and to work hard. But these past weeks have shown me a different kind of strength. Yours, and not just yours, but your people's. I've learned more here than I ever imagined." Nahel looked at him, her eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. "And I've learned something as well," she said. I've learned that trust can be found in unexpected places, and that people can surprise you with their kindness and courage." Their words lingered in the air, carrying a weight of honesty and shared experience. They were no longer just a man who had given a ride and a widow who had accepted it. They were partners in navigating a new and complex life. Their relationship was evolving naturally, built on trust, mutual respect, and the daily acts of living and learning together. Challenges continued to arise. One afternoon, a group of wild cattle wandered too close to the village, threatening to damage crops and homes. John and Nahel quickly organized a small team to guide the animals away. The task required strategy, courage, and quick thinking. John's experience with cattle was invaluable, but Nahel's knowledge of the land and the best routes to drive them safely proved equally critical. Together, they managed to prevent disaster, earning the admiration of the villagers. That evening, as they rested by the fire, John realized how much he had grown. The man who had started this journey unsure of his place in the tribe now felt a deep sense of belonging. And Nahel, who had faced loss and uncertainty, began to see hope for a life that could be fulfilling, even if it was not the one she had imagined when she first mourned her husband. Through work, laughter, shared challenges, and quiet reflection, John and Nahel's connection deepened. It was not a love declared in grand gestures, but a bond formed through respect, understanding, and mutual reliance. They began to anticipate each other's needs, to communicate with a glance or a gesture, and to share the quiet satisfaction of accomplishments achieved together. In the stillness of the desert night, as stars appeared one by one above the ridge, both felt a sense of calm and purpose. They had faced challenges, learned new ways of living, and built trust where there had once been uncertainty. The path ahead remained uncertain, with trials and tests yet to come, but they knew that together they could face whatever the future held. And so, life on the edge of the desert continued, each day a careful balance of work, learning, and quiet companionship. John Harper and Nahel had moved beyond obligation and duty. They had discovered partnership, respect, and the first gentle stirrings of affection. Their journey was far from over, but the foundation was strong, built on shared effort, trust, and the understanding that sometimes, the most unexpected bonds could become the strongest. The days on the edge of the desert had grown longer and busier for John Harper and Nahel. What had started as a simple journey to help a woman reach her people had turned into a life that was both challenging and rewarding. They had settled into routines that combined the ways of the Apache with John's knowledge of ranching. The village had come to accept him, not just as a man bound by law, but as a trusted member of the community. And Nahel, who had once faced life with sorrow and uncertainty, now moved with quiet confidence, knowing she was supported and respected. One morning, as the sun rose in a soft golden haze, John noticed smoke rising in the distance. At first, he thought it might be a controlled fire for land management, something he had seen in other places. But the smoke thickened rapidly and a faint smell of burning filled the air. John's heart sank. The village was in danger. He rode quickly toward the source with Nahel following on foot, her eyes wide with worry. As they approached, they saw that a small section of the village, near the outer homes and granaries, was on fire. A gust of wind had carried embers from a nearby hearth, igniting dry grass and thatched roofs. The villagers were already working to contain the blaze, passing buckets of water and smothering flames with blankets, but the fire spread fast. John leapt from his horse and ran toward the nearest building. Nahel was at his side in an instant, grabbing water and helping guide frightened children to safety. Together, they formed a team, coordinating villagers to create a human chain for water and to clear flammable materials away from the fire. John's experience with ranch fires gave him practical insight, while Nahel's knowledge of the village layout helped them protect key areas. The fire roared, sending sparks into the air and creating a thick cloud of smoke. John and Nahel worked tirelessly, their movements synchronized as if they had done this many times before. Exhaustion pressed on them, but neither thought of stopping. The safety of the people and the homes came first. Hours passed, and the villagers, inspired by John and Nahel's leadership, gradually gained control over the fire. The worst of the flames were extinguished, leaving only charred edges and singed grass. The villagers cheered quietly, relief evident in their eyes. Children clung to their parents, and elders nodded approvingly, recognizing the courage and quick thinking that had prevented disaster. John and Nahel collapsed onto a nearby bench, breathing heavily but smiling with quiet satisfaction. Their hands were scorched and blistered from the heat, their clothes damp with sweat and water, but they felt a deep sense of accomplishment. They had faced danger together and emerged stronger. Later that evening, as the village settled under the stars, the elders gathered John and Nahel. Their faces were calm but serious, conveying both respect and solemnity. "You have proven yourselves," one elder said, his voice deep and steady. "Not only in following our customs, but in protecting our people. This shows honor, courage, and wisdom. The bond between you is no longer only law, it is recognized by all." John felt a swell of emotion. He had known that helping Nahel carried responsibility, but he had not realized that the trials they faced together would solidify their place in the community. Nahel's eyes shone with pride, reflecting the flickering firelight. She realized that the journey that began with sorrow and uncertainty had transformed into something meaningful and lasting. Days after the fire, life returned to a quieter rhythm, but the incident had changed something in both of them. John found himself more connected to the village than ever before. He learned to anticipate the needs of the people, to respect traditions that had initially seemed foreign, and to see the land not just as a resource, but as a shared responsibility. Nahel, too, felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had faced loss, yet she had found trust, partnership, and the possibility of happiness once more. As they worked together in the following weeks, John and Nahel's relationship deepened. It was no longer only about duty or obligation. Shared challenges, quiet conversations, and small acts of kindness had built a foundation of respect and care. They laughed together when mistakes were made, offered comfort in moments of doubt, and silently celebrated each day's successes. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, John and Nahel walked along the ridge overlooking the village. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and earth. They paused, taking in the view, the homes they had protected, the fields they had tended, and the people who had become part of their lives. Nahel broke the silence, her voice soft but confident. "I never imagined my life would change this way," she said. "I thought grief would define me forever, but now I feel strength and hope. You have helped me see that even after loss, life can be full again." John looked at her, his expression earnest. "And you have helped me as well," he replied. "I came here thinking I was only helping you, but I've learned more than I ever imagined. You've taught me patience, wisdom, and the true meaning of community." They stood together in quiet reflection, feeling the deep connection that had grown between them. It was not a sudden declaration of love, but a steady recognition that they had become partners in every sense, trusting, supporting, and learning from each other. The bond between them had grown naturally, rooted in shared experience and mutual respect. As the stars appeared in the night sky, the elders approached them once more. There was a gentle ceremony, simple but significant, acknowledging the formal commitment between John and Nahel. It was a gesture that honored the customs of the Apache people, while also celebrating the partnership that had developed between them. The villagers gathered, offering smiles and quiet congratulations, recognizing that this bond was built on more than law. It was built on care, trust, and shared life. John and Nahel walked through the village afterward, side by side, feeling a sense of peace. The future was still uncertain, as it always was in the desert, but they now faced it together. They had survived trials, learned to respect and understand each other's worlds, and discovered that partnership could grow in the most unexpected ways. The following weeks were filled with continued learning and shared effort. John taught some of the villagers his techniques for tending livestock, while Nahel continued to guide him in understanding the subtle wisdom of her people. Together they built fences, repaired homes, and prepared the land for the changing seasons. Each task, whether small or large, became a symbol of their partnership and commitment. One morning, as they worked side by side in the fields, Nahel paused and looked at John with a quiet smile. "We have come a long way," she said. "From strangers on a dusty trail to this life we share. I never imagined it could be so peaceful." John nodded, his heart full. "It's more than I could have expected. I thought helping you would be a simple act, but it has become the most important part of my life. You have shown me strength, patience, and courage. I am grateful for every day we face together." The bond between them continued to grow. not through grand gestures, but through simple, meaningful actions. Shared meals, working together, comforting each other after difficult days, and celebrating small successes. They began to envision a future not as two separate people brought together by law, but as a partnership built on respect, trust, and mutual care. As months passed, the village flourished. Crops thrived under careful attention, livestock prospered, and the people felt safe and supported. John and Nahel became an integral part of this harmony, their partnership serving as an example of how trust, understanding, and collaboration could bridge even the widest gaps between worlds. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned deep shades of purple and blue, John and Nahel stood on the ridge once more, looking out over the land they had come to love. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of sage and earth. In that quiet moment, they understood that life's greatest rewards were often found in shared effort, kindness, and the courage to embrace the unknown. Nahel rested her hand on John's arm. "We have faced so much together," she said, "and yet I feel that we are only beginning." John smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. "Yes," he said softly, "and whatever comes, we will face it together. We have learned from each other, supported each other, and built something stronger than either of us could have imagined alone." Under the vast Arizona sky, with stars twinkling like distant fires, John Harper and Nahel stood side by side, knowing that their journey had transformed them. What began as a simple act of kindness, giving a ride to a woman in need, had become a story of courage, trust, and the blending of two worlds. They were partners, friends, and companions, bound by law but strengthened by respect, understanding, and the quiet power of shared life. Their story, though unique to them, became a symbol for the village, a tale of honor, resilience, and the unexpected ways in which life could bring people together. It was a story that would be remembered, not for the challenges they faced alone, but for the strength and courage they discovered together. And so, the rancher who had once ridden across open plains and the widow who had once walked alone along dusty trails found not only safety and companionship, but the beginning of a life filled with hope, trust, and the quiet, enduring bond of partnership. The future was theirs to shape, built on the lessons of the past, the strength of their connection, and the shared understanding that sometimes, life's greatest gifts arrive in the most unexpected ways.